Don, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for coming. Let's give Don a warm round of applause. Don, is it true that the reason why you've come to Australia more than 70 times is because you've been waiting for this one invitation to come to Rooty Hill?
I feel as if I finally arrived. Mind you, I was at Toongabbie this morning and said the same thing there.
And you said it in Beijing and Baghdad. Yes, it's a standard line. We're all egocentric. Now, I asked Don to guess what sermon series we're going through, except for tonight, based on the sermons, based on the stage design, and he got it second time round, 1 Peter. That was excellent. But you thought Hebrews was a better fit.
Yeah, I did. Still do.
That's right. So we're going to not waste this and move straight into Hebrews after 1 Peter. Now, Don, you grew up in French Quebec.
I did.
And your father was a pastor. You wrote a great book about his life. You grew up obviously in a Christian home, but you've got to decide to become a Christian. What was your journey in owning your parents' faith and making it your own?
Well, as you said, I was brought up in a Christian home, so I don't remember a time when our family didn't pray together, read the Bible together. My earliest memory was sitting in the bathtub, getting done by my father. And my father...
you mean baptized?
Actually, no. There is a distinction between having a bath and being baptized.
Yes, okay, right.
Has anybody ever explained this to you?
No, but maybe afterwards we could have that conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Mind you, I'm coming up to a point on that where the Baptist heritage does peek out a wee bit. He would tell Bible stories and work his way through the Bible, and the next bath, a little bit of review from last week. And I have to tell you that there's some Old Testament stories that are particularly effective in the bathtub, like Naaman getting dunked in the Jordan River 7 times, worked out. There's the baptism for you a bit, you know? By immersion, did you notice?
Yeah.
Sorry, couldn't resist.
Look, it'll warm your heart.
He stirred for that one.
I did. We've actually got a baptism pool over there.
Good.
I thought it'd make you happy. Now, Don, you grew up. I've just.
No,
heard
I didn't answer your question. Actually, I just told
no,
you.
No, you didn't. That's right. Sorry.
I don't know if I was converted when I was 7, almost 8. I knew the gospel. I was brought up with it. But where a preacher by the name of Sam Michalowski explained carefully what the cross was about, and what sin was about, and I asked Jesus to forgive me my sin. And that may well have been my time of conversion. But when you're brought up in a strong Christian home, sometimes it's hard to discern what is you and what is just mouthing the heritage in which you were brought up. Or second-year university, where I may have got converted then, or maybe it was a crisis of faith as I was maturing. I don't know. But I have a mental checklist of questions to ask God one day. And one of them is, when did you save me? And I suspect he'll smile and answer and say, from before the foundation of the earth, my son.
Excellent. You grew up, I've just heard you in talks share that you were quite sick as a child.
On and off, yeah.
On and off. And your family lived, you didn't have much at home. It was you weren't in abject poverty, but it was poor. It was tough.
Yeah, there were times when we didn't know where the next meal was coming from.
Yeah. And you were the son of a Baptist pastor in French Quebec when relations between Catholicism and Protestantism was quite tense. So all of that, how did that shape you and impact you?
I grew up expecting God to provide for physical needs because he said he would, and we asked him to in prayer. And it taught me to pray. And then years later, when I went to seminary and still didn't have any money, I can remember, for example, going 2 days without any food, just drinking money to keep my stomach from rumbling because I'd run out of money and too proud to ask for help. And I'd start saying things like, you answered my parents' prayers, God, and I'm getting hungry now. And you said that even the birds of the air are cared for, and the cattle on 1,000 hills are yours. You wouldn't mind killing one and giving me a bit of meat, would you? and the Lord answering prayers in all kinds of wonderful ways. So I was brought up with that kind of heritage, and I look at my kids today, and they have more than enough, and they've never had to trust God for necessities. I was brought up having to trust God for necessities, and then Baptist ministers in French Canada spent a total of about 8 years in jail between 1950 and 52. I was just a little gaffer at the time, and we kids were sometimes beaten up because we were maudits protestants, damn Protestants. And so that was part of the heritage, and I just assumed that was normal because it was the only thing I knew. It wasn't heroic or anything, it was just what we knew. And I suppose in my case, probably because I'm too dumb to think of any other thing, but in my case, what that tended to produce in me as I grew older was stamina, perseverance. That sort of background can make you bitter, or it can give you stamina, or it can make you want to escape into an airy-fairy version of Christianity where everything turns out in a Pollyannish happiness and so on. But for whatever reason, it tended to make me put my shoulder to the plow and push.
Beautiful.
But I think the same background could work out in other people's lives in different ways, you know?
Yeah. Bitter or better, that's what it does.
Yeah, and sometimes bitter first and then better.
Yeah, it's a journey. Now, you've had a ministry that really takes you all over the world, from the Middle East to China. You've seen a lot of people endure a lot of persecution, as you had yourself, perhaps on a much larger scale. What do you notice about what's going on in the world, and I guess as you see Christians face life-threatening situations? It's a broad question, but you can pick from that what you like.
Yeah, you have to. Christians sometimes think about persecution romantically. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It's pretty easy to say that when you're in the relatively comfortable West. When Christians are actually going through really tough, violent persecution, it's hard. And it's not always true that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It tends to be the case when there's a wave of persecution that comes, and some people get killed and some people go to jail and so on. And what that tends to do is purify the church. The purely nominal Christians fall away. And then the persecution slacks off a bit, and you have a church then that is eager to witness and push again, and a lot of people get converted. Then persecution comes on, and it purifies the church again. If you have cycles of that thing, then it tends to be the case that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And I could mention some countries where that's really been the case, and the number of Christians has multiplied many, many, many fold in the last 7 or 8 decades. On the other hand, sometimes the blood of the martyrs is the blood of the martyrs, and that's all there is to it, especially where there is adamant imposition of violent persecution and a determination to wipe out the church. Sometimes the church is wiped out. That's what happened in Albania, for example. By the time the Christians got back in after the fall of Ceausescu and friends, there was no church. There were no known confessional Christians there. It was wiped out. So you don't want to be romantic about these things. At the same time, the Bible does say that those who live godly lives in Christ Jesus will suffer some sort of persecution. And sometimes that persecution is just being reviled. Jesus himself says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, "Blessed are you when people revile you and say all manner of evil against you on account of me and for righteousness' sake. Rejoice, be glad. You're aligned with the prophets if you act like that." The Apostle Paul writes to the Philippians in the 1st chapter and says, "It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on his name, but also to suffer for his sake." In other words, you got a gracious gift here, folks. Gracious gift, well, twofold. Number one, faith. God has granted you faith, not only to believe in his name, but he's also granted you the privilege of suffering. And that's just not the way we think in the West. But we remember how the apostles responded when they were first beaten up in Acts chapter 5. The text says, they rejoiced because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. So as the Western world becomes more aggressively sovereign, and where we're losing something of the heritage of freedom of religion and so on, just a wee bit. So there may be some more severe opposition in years and and so on to come. We don't know. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a son of a prophet, and I work for a non-profit organization. And so
a good one.
I refuse to predict the future. But on the other hand, it won't surprise me if things break out a little more here. And then it's going to be really important for Christians to look at it squarely and say, what a privilege to suffer for Jesus. Didn't Jesus say that if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you? If they hated me, they'll hate you. So instead of whining and complaining and having a pity party, how tough it is to be an Australian these days with people sneering at me because of my faith, suck it up. Not only suck it up, but say, what a privilege to suffer for Jesus' sake, and that changes everything. So it's partly a question of whether you're going to walk by faith when this happens, or you're just going to have a pity party.
Now, don't just on that. I mean, it's one thing being beaten, getting a bullet in the head for Jesus, but when you're portrayed as being on the wrong side of history and the oppressor, we're not usually comfortable in that. We're the ones who've been liberating people from mines, from
exactly
poverty.
Right.
But now we sit in an awkward place. That's quite unusual. I mean, in a sense, it's exactly what you've just said, but did you want to say anything more to the kind of, especially the generation, the teens and the 20s who've perhaps grown up in a slightly different world to the one we grew up, which shared more in common with our culture?
Yeah, I'd love to, if this were another sort of evening, I'd love to give an hour to outlining cultural developments in the Western world and how Christians can respond thoughtfully to them. But it really is important to see that for the first 300 years of the Church's life, down to about 300 AD, the most common criticism levied against Christians by Romans in the Roman Empire was that Christians are narrow-minded and bigoted. Does that sound vaguely familiar? And that sometimes broke out about 10 times in cycles of violent persecution of one sort or another. And it was, I'll tell you what the big issue was. The Roman Empire had many religions. But all of them, although they argued for their own corner, claiming their religion was the best, none of them said that theirs was the only way to God. Christians came along and said, well, if you listen to what Jesus says, if you listen to what the apostles say, they're claiming that there is only one way to God, and we can't bow to King Jesus unless we say the same thing. It's a way of looking at the whole universe. You have your multiple gods. There's only one God. And that was viewed as so narrow-minded and exclusivistic and hate-filled and intolerant. All those expressions were used in the first 3 centuries. And Christians gradually overcame it by the numbers of people who got converted, by the love that they showed to people. At the end of the 2nd century, there was a chap called Tertullian during a time of famine in the empire. And he wrote to the emperor and said, don't you understand that the Church of Jesus Christ is feeding not only all of its own people, but half the empire as well? And so in due course, in the grace of God, with time, the integrity of life of Christians began to overcome some of the opprobrium in this regard.
Last question, Don. Thank you so much. ISIS is been on the agenda for the last couple of years. It's made the Al-Qaeda look good. That's how bad they are, which is a hard thing to do. There's just a level of evil that seems to notch it up even further. I guess the question is, some of the folk at church have really, especially some of the guys have battled with, how do I think, feel and pray about ISIS in terms, as a Christian, that loves a God of mercy, who wants us to forgive our enemies, but this is wrong, it's evil. There's kind of a confusion there. What would you say?
In 25 words or less.
We'll give you 30.
It's an important question, but it has a lot of facets to it. You have to remember that God is not only a God of forgiveness, but he's also a God of justice. So let's take it out of ISIS for a moment. When it became clear in World War II, for example, that all those trains heading for eastern Poland were going to Auschwitz in order to burn another trainload full of Jews, what was the right thing for Christians to pray regarding Hitler? Father, forgive him, for he does not know what he's doing? Or, Lord God, send down judgment and stop this evil man from doing any more wickedness? And there is a place for praying along those lines, don't you see? And you can combine the two by saying, it would be spectacular, Lord, if you converted him and brought him to see his own wickedness. But if not, stop him dead in his tracks from doing all this wickedness. I think that it is right and appropriate to pray along those lines. In other words, the Father forgive them, for he knows not what he does, turn the other cheek and all of that, is only one sector of praying in the New Testament. So that you find the saints under the throne, believers under the throne, already in glory in Revelation 6, saying, how long, O Lord, before you step in and effect judgment on all the wickedness that's being done? God is a God of justice as well as being a God of mercy. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is it's really important not to demonize all Muslims. It's easy to respond viscerally against ISIS. And worse than ISIS is Al-Shabaab. They're just unbelievably wicked. But again, from the same stream of Islam. The experts say that about 7% of world Muslims are really committed to a violent sort of jihad. Well, it's only 7%, but when you consider the total number of Muslims, that's a lot of people. But then there are a lot that interpret jihad in a personal sort of spiritual way. A lot of Muslims are just nominal. You don't want to start looking at every Muslim as your enemy. You cannot win Muslims to Christ unless you love them. Plain flat out. So regardless of what's happening in Syria with ISIS, if you've got Muslim neighbors, for all I know, they're Muslims here. Welcome into your home. Eat food together. Break bread. Get to know their children. You can't win anybody to the Lord unless you love them and care for them and interact with them. And so you cannot elevate what might be legitimate military missions from the countries that we represent. You cannot elevate that in importance above the importance of evangelism and winning people to Christ and caring for people individually and so on. I could tell you about a lot of work that's being done. And for those who keep track of these things, there have been more Muslims won to Christ in Middle Eastern countries in the last 20 years than in the previous 300 or 400. And one of the reasons is that all of this violence and this evil is turning off a lot of Muslims. And as a result, not a few of them are trying to find the Prince of Peace. The numbers of people getting converted in Iran are really significant, really spectacular. We have a lot of graduates from the seminary where I teach in Egypt, for example, when the Muslim Brotherhood came to the fore and about 27 churches were burned down. People were burned sometimes inside the churches, and there were a new round of Christian martyrs and so on. I wrote to some of these people and said, how are you going, brother? We're praying for you back at Trinity. Seemed like a safe thing to do because our churches weren't being burned down. And without exception, they wrote back and said, well, we're grateful for your prayers, but you need to understand that we're having the time of our lives. We're seeing more people converted than we've ever seen before. And it was not because they were suddenly more spiritual, it's because there were a lot of Egyptians that were so ticked off against the Muslim Brotherhood that they were looking somewhere else. So life is complex in these kinds of arenas, and you want to be militantly indignant against unrighteousness, but you also want to say there, but for the grace of God go I. We're all miserable sinners, and so the worst evils have to be stopped. God does give the sword to the state. At the same time, that does not take precedence over the importance of winning people to the Lord, and that means loving them, knowing them, caring for them, and eating shish kebabs with the Greeks, and then eating the kind of food that is very common in Muslim countries, Arab countries, depending on which country. And I was in Ethiopia recently, and I love Ethiopian food. That's part of it too. Making friends and caring for people for Jesus' sake.
Beautiful. Don, thank you so much. Don's written heaps of books. Some of them are actually being sold after the service in that corner. So I really commend them to you. Especially How Long, O Lord, it's my favourite. There are just so many. I want to invite, at the end of the service, a number of you want to come and talk to Don, I'm sure. But I'm going to particularly ask those who are inquiring about Christianity and want to know more about Jesus, they have priority. So if that's you, you think, well, that's not me, but it might be at the end of the sermon, the Bible talk, you may think that's me, and you have a real question that he would would that be right, Don? Sure. You would love to have that. I know you well enough to know I can assume that. Please come. And then the rest, if you could just patiently wait and then let them come, whoever they may be, many or few. And then after that, I just need to make that point. Don, thank you so much. Thank you for the blessing you've been. Thank you for being both an academic who is committed to the Word of God with a pastor's heart, and the work you've done with the Gospel Coalition with Tim Keller. You've been a real blessing to so many of us. We thank God for you, brother.
Thank you.